This chapter is an introduction to place, and it will discuss the different contexts that are appropriate for different solutions within the guide. To begin with, you really need to know where you are because different solutions are appropriate in different locations. And what works in the rural environment, the suburban environment, are actually quite different than what works in the urban environment. And the guide focuses on the urban context, and that's what the discussion today will focus on as well. We use the word urban as it applies to walkable, compact, mixed-use environments with blended densities. And in that situation, it doesn't necessarily mean that villages aren't urban or that hamlets aren't urban. It's just talking about the difference between that and a suburban situation or that and a rural situation. So downtowns, village centers, and compact neighborhoods are all contexts that are discussed in detail in the guide and that we'll be talking about today. To begin with, we use the term neighborhood in a way that maybe it's become a bit corrupted over time, in that it doesn't necessarily refer to a compact walkable place. For example, the image on the left is Montpelier, and toward the right edge of that blue circle is the Airbnb that we rented when we were there. And within that 5-minute walk, we could easily get right to downtown, to the heart of downtown. We were in a Airbnb that looked like a single family detached. There were duplexes, there were ADUs within the neighborhood, and then on the walk into town, there were triplexes, 4s, 5s, and live works. I mean, there was a huge diversity of residential densities. And then, of course, all of that was walkable to the mixed use of the downtown center. Now, the image on the right is where I was raised in Huntsville, Alabama. And this is Airport Road is the horizontal arterial. The highway was the parkway, and Whitesburg Drive is where we live. We live just to the residential street to the east of that arterial. And so from our house to that corner of the two arterials, that's where the Ben Franklin's was. And so we were the first kids in the neighborhood that were permitted to cross Whitesburg Drive because it was 6 lanes of traffic. And once we got old enough to go and buy candy and bring it home, then we could upsell it. But the point just being that the lack of walkability in that context really excludes it from the types of neighborhoods that are so rich and so sustainable and really, frankly, so affordable that we found throughout many areas in Vermont. Now, within that neighborhood, there's a variety of barriers to affordability, and most of these are tied to the fact that contemporary laws have been applied on top of historic land patterns. So, for example, your zoning bylaws are in many cases restricting densities that don't reflect the built environment. So this historic cottage in the neighborhood that we were staying is actually a duplex, and it fits in seamlessly within a single family neighborhood, but it is in fact a 2-family house. And in many situations, also your subdivision bylaws have lot sizes that are larger than what was actually historically platted. So anytime you begin having non-conforming disconnects, that reduces access to affordability, because then doing anything with the parcel becomes much more difficult. You have all sorts of barriers to doing anything by right. It takes time, it takes variances, public hearings, and all of that also costs money. In addition to that, the parking requirements are probably the most ubiquitous problem throughout not only Vermont, but the whole United States, because in the 50s, these parking standards were developed that essentially said 2 spots are required per residence. Now, that may be very appropriate in a suburban context or even in a rural context, but in an urban context, it's inappropriate, and it's a huge barrier to affordability because land costs money, and the more parking that's required, the larger your lot has to be, and frankly, the greater the impervious surface becomes, and so the less sustainable it becomes. So parking, you'll see, is the thread that goes through all 3 contexts. And we should also mention that parking requirements also are a reflection of systemic racism, because the assumption that you own 2 cars, it drives up land values because of lot size, and it's a way to shut out people that are of a different demographic or socioeconomic spectrum. So with all of those things in mind, parking requirements maybe should be on your list of one of the first things to adjust. Village centers change a bit. This becomes a little more intense, a greater focus on commercial uses, and as such, one thing that then really becomes a barrier to affordability is in many places in Vermont, we saw that in your bylaws, residential becomes a conditional use, and so there are all these new barriers to getting permission to develop residential within that context. That same thing applies in downtowns. As you become more urban, of course, the parking issue is uniform in being a problem and a barrier. But in downtowns, you have the residential use being conditional is perhaps the biggest barrier. There's also height restrictions that become a barrier in downtown context, because in many situations, building heights are historic buildings are taller than what is permitted under the feet requirement of your zoning bylaws. And so what we recommend you consider is permitting height by story and making that match your historic context rather than by feet. Another issue that this is a common issue as well in village centers, but the non-conforming setback is a real problem in downtown. We saw across many of the zoning bylaws that we looked at in Vermont a standard 20-foot front setback, and it just isn't the context in your historic downtowns. And so one thing that should happen is that the setback should reflect the context, and then it makes those properties developable.